The shell that would shatter Giovanni Simoncini's mind forever was still 7 minutes away when he first heard the whistle. Not the one that would destroy him, another one, softer, almost musical, like a bird calling through the morning mist that hung over the trenches like a burial shroud. Nobody could have known that in exactly 7 minutes, Corporal Giovanni Simoncini would become a different person entirely. Nobody could have predicted that the same man who had just shared his last cigarette with Private Chen would be found 3 hours later, crouched in a corner, eyes wide and unblinking, whispering his mother's name to the rats. But that's getting ahead of the story. Giovanni adjusted his helmet for the 100th time that morning. The strap had loosened again, and the damn thing kept sliding down over his eyes. It was a habit now, this constant adjusting, this need to feel secure when nothing about their situation was even remotely secure. The trench stretched out before him like an open grave, filled with men who looked more like corpses every day. "You hear that?" Private Chen whispered, tilting his head toward the eastern parapet. He was new, barely 18, with skin that still remembered what soap felt like. Giovanni envied him that memory. "Hear what?" Giovanni's voice came out rougher than he intended. 3 months in the trenches had turned his throat into sandpaper. Chen pointed toward the horizon where the morning sun was trying unsuccessfully to burn through the perpetual haze of smoke and decay. "Sounds like singing." Giovanni listened. There was something out there, beyond the usual symphony of distant gunfire and dying men. A high, clear note that didn't belong in this landscape of mud and despair. But what Giovanni didn't know was that the sound Chen was hearing wasn't singing at all. It was the whistle of incoming artillery, still too far away to register as danger, still soft enough to mistake for something beautiful. And in exactly 6 minutes and 30 seconds, that beautiful sound would tear through their section of the trench like the fist of an angry god. Giovanni had been a corporal for exactly 9 days. 9 days of pretending he knew what he was doing while men who trusted him looked for guidance he didn't have. 9 days of making decisions that kept some men alive and got others killed, with no way to know which was which until it was too late. The promotion hadn't been an honor. It was mathematics. His previous corporal had stopped a sniper's bullet with his forehead, and Giovanni was simply the next name on a very short list. They pinned the stripe to his mud-caked uniform while his predecessor's blood was still warm in the dirt. Leadership isn't about being brave, Lieutenant Morrison had told him during the 30-second ceremony that passed for military tradition in hell. It's about making choices when all the choices are wrong. Giovanni was beginning to understand what that meant. What he didn't understand yet was that in 5 minutes and 45 seconds, he would face a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life, assuming he lived long enough to have a rest of his life. Private Chen was still staring at the horizon, that look of nervous wonder that marked him as dangerously new. Beside him, Sergeant Torres was cleaning his rifle with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that survival lay in the details. Torres had been in the trenches since the beginning, a lifetime ago, when men still believed in victory. "Chen," Giovanni said quietly, "get away from the wall." "But Corporal, I can almost see, now." The sharpness in Giovanni's voice surprised them both. But something about that distant sound was making his skin crawl. It was too pure, too clean for this place where everything beautiful had long since been murdered. Chen stepped back, confusion flickering across his young face. "Sir, is something?" The first shell hit 400 yards to their left. The sound was indescribable, not just loud, but wrong, like the earth itself screaming. The ground beneath their feet jumped, and a shower of dirt and worse things rained down into their section of the trench. Giovanni felt his teeth rattle in his skull. Down. Torres was already moving, grabbing men and shoving them against the trench wall. Incoming. But Giovanni Simoncini was no longer listening to Torres. He was counting. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3 Mississippi. Because somewhere in his training, someone had told him you could predict the next impact by timing the first. What they hadn't told him was what would happen when the counting became the only thing standing between him and complete madness. For minutes and 20 seconds, the second shell hit closer, close enough that Giovanni could feel the heat of the explosion against his face. Close enough that clods of earth peppered his helmet like hail. Close enough that he could smell the cordite mixing with the stench of the trench. "They've got our range," someone screamed, but the voice was already lost in the growing chaos. Giovanni pressed himself against the trench wall, feeling the wood and sandbags shudder with each impact. Around him, his men were doing the same, good soldiers following good training, all of them pretending this was survivable. 3 minutes and 50 seconds, the third shell was a near miss that collapsed part of the eastern wall. Giovanni watched a section of carefully constructed defense work crumble like a child's sandcastle, burying Private Martinez under tons of mud and timber. Only Martinez's hand was visible afterward, fingers still twitching in a rhythm that meant nothing and everything. What Giovanni couldn't know was that his mind was already beginning to fracture. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in hairline cracks that would spread and deepen until the men who had been Giovanni Simoncini would be buried as surely as Martinez was buried under that collapsed wall. Torres was shouting orders, organizing a rescue party, doing the things corporals were supposed to do. Giovanni tried to move, tried to help, but his legs had forgotten how to obey him. He stood there, useless, watching Torres take charge of men who should have been following Giovanni's orders. The shame was immediate and burning. Here he was, frozen in place while better men risked their lives to save Martinez, Martinez who might already be dead, who probably was dead, whose twitching hand might just be a nervous reaction that would stop any second now. 3 minutes and 10 seconds. But Giovanni's real torment hadn't even begun yet. Giovanni began counting shell impacts because it gave his mind something to hold on to. 1, 2, 3. Each explosion mapped out in his head like a deadly constellation. He started to see patterns where there weren't any, started to believe he could predict where the next shell would fall based on some mathematical sequence that existed only in his growing panic. 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the fourth shell hit their communications trench, severing their connection to the command post. Now they were truly alone, 43 men in a muddy hole, waiting for death to find their coordinates. "We need to move." Torres was still shouting, still trying to impose order on chaos. "If they walk the barrage this way, no." Giovanni's voice was barely a whisper, but somehow Torres heard it. "Sir. We stay. Moving makes us targets." It wasn't strategy. It wasn't tactics. It was terror masquerading as leadership, and Giovanni knew it even as the words left his mouth. But the alternative, ordering these men to climb out of the trench and run across open ground while shells rained down, felt like murder. 2 minutes. What Giovanni didn't realize was that staying put was just a different kind of murder, slower but just as certain. And in exactly 2 minutes, he would understand the true weight of command in the most horrible way possible. The fifth shell hit their supply depot. Giovanni watched crates of ammunition explode in a chain reaction that lit up the morning sky like a premature sunrise. The heat washed over them in waves, and Giovanni could smell his own hair singing. Private Chin was crying now, not sobbing, just tears streaming down his dirt-caked cheeks while he clutched his rifle like a talisman. Giovanni wanted to comfort him, wanted to say something that would make this better, but what words existed for this kind of horror? 1 minute and 30 seconds, the sixth shell fell short, landing in the no man's land between the trenches. It sent up a geyser of mud and metal and things that had once been men from previous battles. Giovanni watched pieces of uniform flutter down like obscene confetti. 1 minute, his hands were shaking now. Not trembling, shaking, like he was caught in an earthquake that only he could feel. The rifle in his grip felt impossibly heavy, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd blinked. 30 seconds. Corporal. Chen's voice seemed to come from very far away. Corporal, what do we do? This was the question that would break Giovanni Simoncini's mind. Not the shells, not the death, not the mud or the rats or the stench of rotting flesh. It was the simple faith in a boy's voice, the trust that Giovanni would have an answer when Giovanni knew he had nothing to give. 15 seconds. Giovanni began, but the words died in his throat. Because in 15 seconds, the 7th shell would hit their trench directly, and Giovanni would learn what it meant to be responsible for men who died following his orders. 10 seconds. Chen was still looking at him with those trusting eyes, still waiting for wisdom that didn't exist. 5 seconds. Giovanni opened his mouth to give an order, any order, that might save them. But he was already too late. The 7th shell landed exactly where Giovanni was standing. By every law of physics and probability, he should have died instantly. Should have been vaporized along with the section of trench where he'd been frozen in indecision. Should have become just another name on a casualty report that nobody would ever read. Instead, the shell was a dud. Punched through the earth like a meteorite, burying itself 8 feet deep in the mud at Giovanni's feet. And then, nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that follows a thunderclap, when the world holds its breath and waits to see what happens next. Giovanni stared down at the hole where death had tried and failed to find him. Steam rose from the crater where the hot metal was cooling in the cold mud. He could see the nose of the shell, still intact, still lethal, just waiting. But what Giovanni didn't know was that surviving that shell would be far worse than dying from it. What he didn't know was that his mind, already stretched to the breaking point, would interpret this miracle as something it was never meant to bear. Jesus Christ, Torres whispered. Jesus bloody Christ. Around them, the other men began to emerge from where they'd thrown themselves against the trench walls. Slowly, carefully, like creatures crawling out from under rocks. Their faces were gray with shock and dirt and the terrible understanding that they should all be dead. Chen was the first to speak. Corporal, how did you know? How did you know to step back? How did you know it would be a dud? How did you know we'd survive? The questions hung in the air like smoke. Giovanni opened his mouth to explain that he hadn't known anything, that it was pure luck, that survival in war was nothing but random chance wearing the mask of strategy, but the words wouldn't come. 7 minutes after the shell that should have killed him failed to explode, Giovanni Simoncini spoke his first words as a broken man. I can't. The sentence died there, unfinished, because Giovanni had discovered something terrible about the human mind. It needs patterns. It needs reasons. It needs to believe that survival means something more than accident. His brain, desperate to make sense of the impossible, began constructing a narrative. Maybe he was chosen. Maybe he was protected. Maybe he had some special ability to sense danger. Maybe God or fate or simple mathematics had marked him as special. And maybe that was the beginning of Giovanni Simoncini's descent into madness. Sir. Chen was still waiting for an answer, still believing that Giovanni possessed some wisdom, some insight that had saved them all. Giovanni looked at the boy's trusting face and felt something fundamental shift inside his mind. A weight settling in, heavy and permanent. These men were alive because of him. This miracle was his responsibility. Their survival was his burden. But hang on, you haven't seen the worst part yet. The eighth shell hit the northern section of their trench. This one wasn't a dud. The explosion was so close that Giovanni felt it in his bones before he heard it. The concussion wave lifted him off his feet and slammed him against the trench wall hard enough to crack 2 ribs. When his vision cleared, he saw Torres lying motionless in the mud, blood trickling from his ears, but it wasn't Torres that broke Giovanni's mind. It was Private Matthews. Matthews had been standing 20 feet away when the shell hit. Now he was distributed across the trench walls, hanging from the wire, scattered in pieces too small to identify and too numerous to count. What had been a young man from Birmingham who collected stamps and wrote poetry was now just evidence of impact. What Giovanni saw next would change him forever, but you're not ready for that part yet. Giovanni tried to stand and found that his legs had forgotten their purpose. He wasn't wounded, not physically. But something essential had disconnected, like a wire pulled loose in the machinery of his mind. Corporal. Chen was shaking him, his young face streaked with tears and other people's blood. Corporal, what do we do? And there it was again, that question that was slowly destroying Giovanni's sanity. Giovanni looked around the trench and began counting. Not shell impacts this time, but men. Living men. Men who were depending on him to make decisions when his brain felt like it was full of cotton and broken glass. 17. He counted 17 living soldiers in their section. 17 men whose survival was now his responsibility. 17 reasons why he couldn't afford to fall apart, but his mind was already falling apart. The real horror was just beginning. Giovanni discovered that leadership in the trenches wasn't about making good decisions. It was about making any decision at all when paralysis would kill everyone. Torres was unconscious but breathing. Matthews was gone. Private Rodriguez had taken shrapnel in his leg but was still functional. The rest of the men were looking at Giovanni with expressions that ranged from trust to terror to the kind of desperate hope that came from having no other options. Status report, Giovanni managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. The responses came in fragments. Northern wall is down, lost contact with command, Rodriguez needs medical, water barrel took a hit. Each piece of information felt like another weight added to a scale that was already bending under the load. Giovanni tried to process it all, tried to formulate a plan, tried to be the leader these men needed. But what Giovanni couldn't see was that his mind was performing a different kind of calculation entirely. It was measuring the distance between sanity and collapse, and finding that distance much shorter than anyone had ever imagined. Sir. Rodriguez was looking at him with eyes that had gone glassy with pain. Sir, what are our orders? Giovanni opened his mouth and found it full of dust. He tried to speak and produced only a sound like paper tearing. Around him, 17 men waited for wisdom that didn't exist. And that's when it happened. The moment that would define the rest of Giovanni Simoncini's life, however long that life might last. The counting started again. But this time, it wasn't shells. It was heartbeats. 1 heartbeat. 2 heartbeat. 3 heartbeat. 4. Giovanni could hear them all, 17 distinct rhythms drumming out 17 different songs of terror. Chen's was fast and rabbit quick. Rodriguez's was slow and labored, fighting against the pain in his shattered leg. Torres's was steady but weak, the rhythm of a man dancing on the edge of consciousness. But wait, there's something you need to understand about what was happening to Giovanni's mind. The human brain, when pushed beyond its limits, doesn't break cleanly. It doesn't shatter like glass or snap like a twig. It frays, like rope under too much tension, strand by strand, until what's left can no longer hold the weight it was designed to carry. Giovanni's mind was fraying. He could feel it happening, could sense the individual threads of his sanity pulling apart with each heartbeat he counted, each decision he failed to make, each second that passed without him providing the leadership these men desperately needed. 5 heartbeat. 6 heartbeat. 7 heartbeat. Corporal. Chen's voice was getting smaller, more frightened. "Sir, are you all right?" The answer was no. Giovanni Simoncini was not all right. Giovanni Simoncini would never be all right again. But he couldn't tell Chen that, because Chen was 18 years old and still believed that corporals had answers. Giovanni tried to focus on practical matters. They needed to check for wounded. They needed to repair the wall. They needed to re-establish contact with command. They needed to assess their ammunition, their water, their food situation, but his brain kept counting heartbeats instead. 8 heartbeat. 9 heartbeat. 10 heartbeat. And the strangest part, Giovanni was starting to hear heartbeats that weren't there. 11 heartbeat. 12 heartbeat. 13 heartbeat. Wait, Giovanni stopped counting and looked around the trench again. Carefully this time. Methodically. 17 men. He had counted 17 living men. So why was he hearing 18 heartbeats? This is where things get truly disturbing. The 18th heartbeat was coming from the crater where the dud shell lay buried. Steady, strong, almost mechanical. Like the pulse of some underground heart that fed on violence and fear. Giovanni knew it was impossible. Shells didn't have heartbeats. Explosives didn't develop pulses. But he could hear it as clearly as he could hear Chen's panicked breathing or Rodriguez's groans of pain. And that phantom heartbeat was about to become Giovanni's new obsession. "Sir." Torres had regained consciousness, though his eyes were unfocused and blood continued to leak from his ears. "What's the situation?" Giovanni tried to answer but found himself listening instead. Listening to the rhythm that shouldn't exist, counting beats that couldn't be real, feeling his grip on reality slip 1 heartbeat at a time. 18 heartbeat. 19 heartbeat. 20 heartbeat. No, wait. Now there were 21 heartbeats. How was that possible? Giovanni looked around the trench again, counting faces this time instead of sounds. Chen, Torres, Rodriguez, Williams, Parker, O'Brien, Kowalski, 17 men. Still 17. The math didn't work. Unless you counted the dead. Now here's where Giovanni Simoncini's story takes a turn that will make you question everything you thought you knew about war, survival, and the price of leadership. The 21st heartbeat was coming from where Private Matthews used to stand. Where Private Matthews had been standing when the shell turned him into a fine red mist. Giovanni could pinpoint the location exactly, 3 feet from the eastern wall, next to the ammunition boxes, where the mud was still dark with blood. Thump thump. Thump thump. Thump thump. Steady as a metronome. Strong as a marathon runner's pulse. Impossible as resurrection. Giovanni closed his eyes and tried to make it stop. He pressed his hands against his ears and tried to block out the sound. But the heartbeats weren't coming through his ears. They were coming from inside his head, generated by a mind that had decided reality was too brutal to accept without modification. "Matthews," Giovanni whispered. Torres looked at him sharply. "Sir?" "Matthews is gone." "I know." Giovanni's voice was barely audible. "I know he's gone. But he's still here." And that's when Giovanni Simoncini crossed a line that you don't come back from. That's when survival became something more terrifying than death. 3 minutes and 12 seconds until the shell that would complete Giovanni's transformation. The phantom heartbeats were multiplying. Matthews was there, steady and strong. Then came Corporal Bradley, Giovanni's predecessor, keeping time with a bullet hole through his forehead. Then Private Wilson, who had died from infection 2 weeks ago, his pulse erratic and feverish even in death. Giovanni could hear them all, a growing orchestra of the dead playing a symphony only he could perceive. And the worst part? They were giving him advice. "Trust me, you don't want to hear what the dead were telling Giovanni Simoncini." "You should have saved me," Matthews whispered, his voice carrying perfectly through the din of ongoing artillery. "You were supposed to be watching the eastern approach. You were supposed to see the shell coming." "Leadership is about sacrifice," added Bradley, his tone patient and instructional. "You understand that now, don't you, Giovanni? Every decision you make kills someone. The only choice is who." "The pain stops eventually," Wilson contributed, his voice thick with the memory of fever. "But the responsibility never does. You'll carry us with you forever, Giovanni. Every man who dies under your command becomes part of you." Giovanni pressed his hands harder against his ears, but the voices only grew louder. 2 minutes and 36 seconds. And Giovanni was about to learn that the dead have very strong opinions about how the living should behave. "Corporal." Chen was shaking him now, his young hands grabbing Giovanni's shoulders with desperate strength. "Sir, we need orders. The shelling's getting closer." Giovanni looked at Chen and saw, superimposed over the boy's frightened face, the ghost of Matthews. Matthews with his stamps and poetry and dreams of surviving the war. Matthews who had trusted Giovanni to keep him alive and who was now nothing but heartbeats and whispered accusations. But you still don't understand the true horror of Giovanni's situation. The dead weren't just talking to him. They were arguing. "Save Chen," Matthews urged. "He's just a boy. Get him out of here." "Chen is expendable," Bradley countered. "Torres has experience. Focus on Torres." "They're all going to die anyway," Wilson added with the bitter wisdom of someone who had already crossed that threshold. "The only question is how much of yourself you'll lose trying to save them." 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Giovanni realized he was nodding along with the conversation. Nodding and responding to voices that only he could hear while 17 living men watched their corporal argue with empty air. And that's when things got truly terrifying. Here's what you need to understand about Giovanni Simoncini's breakdown: it wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was methodical, logical, almost scientific in its precision. His mind was creating a new reality because the old reality was unsurvivable. In the new reality, the dead didn't simply disappear. They became advisors, consultants in the business of staying alive. Their experience with death made them uniquely qualified to help the living avoid it. It made perfect sense, if you didn't think about it too hard. 1 minute and 50 seconds. "We need to move the wounded," Giovanni announced, his voice suddenly clear and confident. He was taking advice from Corporal Bradley, who had led men for 6 months before a sniper ended his career. "Sir." Torres struggled to sit up, his concussion making every movement a careful negotiation with gravity. "Move them where?" "The secondary trench," Giovanni replied promptly. Bradley was nodding approvingly in his peripheral vision. 200 yards west. Better cover, closer to medical. It was a good plan. A reasonable plan. A plan that might actually save lives. The only problem was that the secondary trench had been abandoned 3 weeks ago. 1 minute and 20 seconds. Sir, Torres said carefully, the secondary trench was overrun. It's in enemy hands now. Giovanni blinked. Bradley's ghost flickered like a candle in the wind, his advice suddenly uncertain. Then we. Giovanni's newfound confidence evaporated. The dead were arguing again, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of conflicting wisdom. And in exactly 1 minute and 20 seconds, Giovanni would discover that the living dead weren't the only impossible thing he'd encounter that morning. 1 minute, the shelling stopped, complete. Absolute silence fell over the battlefield like a suffocating blanket. Giovanni's ears, which had grown accustomed to the constant percussion of artillery, began ringing in the sudden quiet. Around him, 17 men held their breath and waited for whatever came next. But Giovanni was listening to something else entirely. The phantom heartbeats were syncing up. All of them, Matthews, Bradley, Wilson, and the growing crowd of dead advisors, were beginning to beat in unison. Like a war drum. Like a marching cadence. Like the footsteps of an army that existed only in Giovanni's fracturing mind. 50 seconds. Something's wrong, Torres muttered, his soldiers' instincts overriding his concussion. They don't just stop shelling unless they're coming, Giovanni finished, the word supplied by a dozen dead corporals who had learned this lesson the hard way. 40 seconds, Giovanni peered over the parapet, his eyes scanning the cratered landscape of no man's land. At first, he saw nothing but smoke and mud and the twisted remains of barbed wire. Then the smoke began to clear. What he saw coming toward them would make the shell attack seem like a gentle spring rain. 30 seconds, they moved like wolves through the fog, gray shapes flowing between the craters, using the shell smoke as cover. Not running, not charging, just flowing. Like water finding the path of least resistance. Contact. Torres was shouting, his training overriding his injuries. Enemy infantry. Eastern approach. 20 seconds, Giovanni counted them automatically. 15. No, 20. No, more than that, they kept appearing from the smoke like materializing demons. 30 men at least, maybe 40, all armed, all moving with the terrible efficiency of soldiers who had done this many times before. 10 seconds until Giovanni Simoncini made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The dead were unanimous now. Every phantom voice in Giovanni's head was screaming the same advice: run. 5 seconds, Giovanni opened his mouth to give the order to retreat. It was the smart choice, the rational choice, the choice that might save some of his men's lives. They were outnumbered, outgunned, caught in a position that couldn't be defended. But Giovanni Simoncini was no longer capable of making rational choices. Instead of ordering a retreat, Giovanni stood up. What happened next defied every rule of military strategy, common sense, and self-preservation that Giovanni had ever been taught. Giovanni Simoncini stood up in the middle of an enemy assault and began walking toward the approaching soldiers, not running. Not charging. Walking, his rifle hung at his side, unfired. His hands were steady for the first time in hours. His face was calm, almost peaceful, like a man who had finally found the answer to a question that had been torturing him. "Sir!" Chen screamed. "Get down!" "Sir!" But Giovanni kept walking. Because the voices of the dead had told him something that the living could never understand. The approaching enemy soldiers saw him coming and slowed their advance. This wasn't normal. Soldiers didn't walk calmly toward certain death. They ran, or they hid, or they fought. They didn't stroll across a battlefield like they were taking an evening walk through a park. Giovanni could see their confusion in their body language, the way they glanced at each other, the way their formation loosened, the way some of them actually lowered their weapons slightly. What Giovanni had discovered was that madness, in certain circumstances, could be more effective than strategy. Now here's where Giovanni Simoncini's story becomes truly impossible to believe. One of the enemy soldiers, an officer, judging by his insignia, called out in accented English, "Halt! Stop there." Giovanni stopped. Not because he was ordered to, but because Private Matthews had whispered in his ear, "This is far enough." The enemy officer approached cautiously, his rifle trained on Giovanni's chest. He was young, probably younger than Giovanni, with the kind of clean-shaven face that meant he hadn't been in the trenches long enough to give up on appearances. "Why do you not run?" the officer asked. His English was careful, precise, like he was reading from a phrase book. Giovanni considered the question. Around him, the ghosts of his dead soldiers waited for his answer with the same curiosity as the living enemy who might kill him in the next 30 seconds. What Giovanni said next would change everything. "Because," Giovanni replied, his voice steady and conversational, "running won't change what I've done." The enemy officer frowned. "What you have done?" "I got them killed," Giovanni explained, gesturing back toward the trench where 17 terrified men were watching this impossible conversation unfold. Matthews, Bradley, Wilson, all of them. I was supposed to protect them, and I got them killed instead. But the enemy officer's response was not what Giovanni expected. The enemy officer lowered his rifle slightly. His expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been recognition, or horror. "You are shell-shocked?" he asked quietly. Giovanni laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Shell-shocked? Is that what you call it when the dead won't leave you alone? When you can hear the heartbeats of men who don't have hearts anymore? When you're responsible for keeping alive people who should never have been in this situation in the first place?" What happened next violated every rule of warfare that either side had been taught. The enemy officer actually stepped closer. "How long?" he asked. "How long what? How long have you been hearing them?" The voices. Giovanni stared at the men who should have been his enemy and saw something unexpected in his eyes, understanding. Because this enemy officer had his own collection of ghosts. "Every night," the officer whispered, "I hear my men. The ones I lost at Stalingrad. They tell me what I should have done differently. They tell me who I should have saved." For a moment that lasted either seconds or hours, two broken soldiers stood in no man's land and shared the weight of command that no training had prepared them to carry. But their moment of connection was about to be shattered by the cruelest irony of war. Just when you thought Giovanni's story couldn't get more tragic. The shot came from the Allied lines. Their own sniper, watching through his scope, saw an enemy officer talking to what appeared to be a surrendering Allied soldier. He did what snipers are trained to do. He eliminated the threat. The bullet took the enemy officer in the chest, spinning him around before dropping him face first into the mud. His last words were in a language Giovanni didn't understand, but the tone was universal: surprise, pain, and something that might have been regret. Giovanni knelt beside the dying man and felt something else break inside his mind. Because for just a moment, he had connected with another human being who understood the impossible weight of leadership in war. and now that connection was bleeding out in the mud at his feet. "I'm sorry," Giovanni whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to the dying officer or to Matthews or to Chen or to himself. The officer's eyes found Giovanni's face and held there. "The voices," he gasped. Do they ever stop?" Giovanni wanted to lie, wanted to offer some comfort to this man who had shown him unexpected humanity in the middle of inhumanity. But Giovanni Simoncini was no longer capable of lies. "No," he said quietly. "They never stop." The officer smiled, actually smiled, as if this was exactly the answer he'd been hoping for. Then his eyes went glassy, and his heartbeat joined the phantom orchestra in Giovanni's head. 19 heartbeats now. 19 voices offering advice he didn't want from beyond a grave he couldn't escape. Giovanni walked back to the Allied trench in a daze. The remaining enemy soldiers had melted away, their assault broken by the surreal encounter they'd just witnessed. Nobody wanted to attack a position defended by madmen. "Sir." Chen rushed to meet him. "Sir, are you hurt? We saw you talking to him. We thought." "I'm fine," Giovanni lied. It was possibly the biggest lie ever told in a war famous for its lies. Torres was back on his feet, leaning heavily against the trench wall but functional. "Orders, sir." And there it was again. That question. That impossible, unanswerable question that was slowly eating Giovanni alive from the inside. Giovanni looked at his men, really looked at them. Chen with his young face and older eyes. Torres with his experience and fresh blood. Rodriguez with his wounded leg and stubborn refusal to admit he needed evacuation. All of them waiting for him to make decisions that would determine who lived and who died. But Giovanni had finally learned the truth about command in warfare. "Dig in," he said finally. "Repair the wall. Check the wounded. Wait for orders from command. Standard procedures. Safe procedures. Procedures that wouldn't save anyone but wouldn't get anyone killed immediately either." Because Giovanni Simoncini had discovered that the only way to lead men in hell was to stop trying to lead them out of it. 6 hours after the shell that should have killed him, Giovanni Simoncini had become something that the army didn't have a name for. He functioned. That was the word the officers would use later when they tried to explain why they didn't relieve him of command despite the obvious signs of psychological damage. Corporal Simoncini functioned. He gave appropriate orders at appropriate times. He maintained discipline. He kept accurate records. He distributed rations fairly and organized work details efficiently. By every metric the army cared about, he was performing his duties satisfactorily. What they didn't see was the conversation he was having with 19 dead soldiers every moment of every day. The phantom heartbeats had become his new reality. He could distinguish between them now, could identify Matthews by his quick, nervous rhythm, Bradley by his steady command pulse, Wilson by his fever-weak flutter. They were as real to him as the living men under his command, and significantly more talkative. But you haven't heard the most disturbing part yet. The dead were better advisors than the living. Matthews warned him about weak spots in the trench wall that would collapse in the next rain. Bradley suggested supply routes that avoided known sniper positions. Wilson identified symptoms of trench foot before they became serious enough to disable soldiers. Giovanni's madness was keeping his men alive. 3 weeks after his breakdown, though nobody called it that, Giovanni was promoted to sergeant. The promotion came with a brief ceremony in a bombed-out church behind the lines. An officer who had never seen combat pinned new stripes to Giovanni's uniform while citing his exceptional leadership under fire, and his innovative tactical approaches to trench warfare. Giovanni nodded and said thank you and tried to ignore the fact that 23 dead soldiers were now offering commentary on the proceedings. Because his collection of phantom advisors had grown. Every man who died under his command joined the chorus in his head. Not just Allied soldiers, the enemy officer from that morning was there too, along with 3 German privates who had been killed in a raid Giovanni had planned. Death, it seemed, was an equal opportunity employer when it came to haunting Giovanni Simoncini. "You're moving up in the world," Matthews observed dryly during the ceremony. "Too bad the world is moving down around you." The promotion came with new responsibilities, a larger section of trench, more men to command, more decisions to make. More opportunities for Giovanni to add new voices to his phantom army. Giovanni's new duties included writing letters to the families of dead soldiers. Standard procedure required him to use standard language. "Your son died bravely in service to his country. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. He spoke of you often." But Giovanni could no longer write standard letters. Because the dead men were standing over his shoulder, dictating their own messages. "Tell my mother I was scared," Matthews insisted. "Tell her I cried for her when the shell hit. Tell her I wasn't brave." "Don't tell them anything," Bradley advised. "Let them keep their illusions. The truth won't bring us back." "Tell them it hurts," Wilson whispered. "Tell them dying hurts more than they imagine, and it doesn't stop hurting just because you're dead." Giovanni tried to write the standard letters, but his hand kept adding details that regulations prohibited. Personal details. True details. Details that would destroy families but might also honor the reality of what their sons had experienced. Every letter became a battle between official lies and impossible truths. He would write, "Your son died instantly and felt no pain," then cross it out and write, "Your son called for you as he died, and his voice broke my heart." He would write, "He was a credit to his unit," then add, "He was 19 years old and should have been home studying for exams instead of learning how to kill strangers." Most of the letters were never sent. Giovanni would finish them, read them over, then tear them up and start again with the approved language. The dead would watch him destroy their truth and shake their heads in disappointment. But the families never knew how close they came to receiving letters that would have changed everything they believed about war, sacrifice, and the price of serving your country. 2 months after his first shell shock attack, Giovanni Simoncini discovered that madness, like everything else in war, could get worse. The voices of the dead had become a constant background noise, like radio static that never quite tuned out. He could function with them, work around them, even take their advice when it proved useful. They were part of his new normal. But then Private Chin died, and everything changed again. It happened during a routine patrol. Giovanni had been leading a small scouting party through the communication trenches when a mortar shell, just one, random and unannounced, dropped out of the sky like a malicious gift. Chen was walking point, 5 yards ahead of Giovanni, when the shell hit. What Giovanni saw in that moment would have broken a stronger man than he had ever been. The explosion lifted Chen off his feet and threw him against the trench wall with enough force to crack timber. But he didn't die immediately. That would have been merciful. Instead, Chen lived for 17 minutes. 17 minutes of consciousness while his body shut down piece by piece. 17 minutes of looking at Giovanni with eyes that still held trust, still believed that Sergeant Simoncini would find a way to fix this. 17 minutes of whispered words that Giovanni would hear for the rest of his life. "Sergeant, did I do good? Did I follow orders right? I tried to be brave like you taught me. Giovanni held Chen's hand while the boy died, and felt the exact moment when Chen's heartbeat joined the phantom orchestra in his head. But Chen's ghost was different from the others. Where Matthews offered bitter wisdom and Bradley provided tactical advice and Wilson shared the perspective of someone who had already crossed over, Chen brought something else entirely. Innocence questioned. "Why did you send me to Walk Point, Sergeant?" Chen asked that first night, his phantom voice carrying the same trusting tone it had held in life. "Did you know what would happen?" Giovanni tried to explain. "It was standard procedure. Someone had to Walk Point." Chen was quick, observant, good at spotting trouble. It had been a tactical decision, not a personal one. But Chen's ghost wasn't satisfied with tactical explanations. "But you chose me," Chen persisted. "Out of everyone, you picked me to go first. You picked me to die." "I didn't know," Giovanni began. "But you suspected," Chen interrupted. "Everyone always suspects. That's why point men die more often. You just decided it should be me instead of someone else." And that's when Giovanni realized the true horror of command. Every decision that saves one life condemns another. Every choice has a body count. Every order signed someone's death warrant. 3 months after his first shell shock attack, Giovanni Simoncini was commanding the dead more efficiently than he had ever commanded the living. His phantom army had grown to 37 voices. 37 heartbeats. 37 sets of advice, complaints, accusations, and observations. They never slept, never rested, never gave him a moment of silence to think his own thoughts. But here's the truly disturbing part: Giovanni was starting to prefer their company to that of the living. The dead were honest. They didn't pretend war was noble or necessary or anything other than a machine designed to feed young men into the ground. They didn't lie about chances of survival or the importance of sacrifice. They just told the truth, over and over, until Giovanni's understanding of reality became clearer than it had ever been. The living men under his command began to notice changes in his behavior. He would stand motionless for minutes at a time, nodding and occasionally muttering responses to conversations they couldn't hear. He would give orders that seemed to come from nowhere but invariably proved correct. He would warn them about dangers that hadn't materialized yet but somehow always did. Giovanni Simoncini was becoming the most effective military leader in his sector, and the most insane. For months after his breakdown, Giovanni received a commendation for exceptional battlefield intuition and innovative leadership techniques. The citation specifically mentioned his ability to anticipate enemy movements, avoid casualties through seemingly impossible tactical awareness, and maintain unit cohesion under extreme stress. What it didn't mention was that Giovanni's battlefield intuition came from consulting with an ever-growing board of directors who happened to be dead, but recognition came with a price. The promotion to lieutenant meant more men under his command. More responsibility. More decisions. More opportunities to add new voices to the phantom conference that had taken up permanent residence in his head. And the dead had opinions about his promotion. "You're moving up," Matthews observed during the ceremony. "Getting good at using us." "That's what we're here for," Bradley added. "To make sure you don't make the same mistakes we did." "But every promotion means more of us," Wilson warned. "How many voices can one mind hold before it stops being a mind?" It was a question Giovanni would soon discover the answer to. Lieutenant Simoncini's first major command decision came exactly 1 week after his promotion. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were planning a major assault on their section of the line. Giovanni was ordered to hold the position at all costs with 83 men, the largest force he had ever commanded. But intelligence reports, Giovanni had learned, were usually wrong about everything except the body count. The assault came at dawn, just as his phantom advisors had predicted. Not from the east where intelligence suggested, but from the north, where a supposedly impassable marsh had frozen solid enough to support advancing troops. Giovanni watched 300 enemy soldiers emerge from the morning mist like a plague of gray locusts. His 83 men looked to him for orders, for wisdom, for some indication that he had a plan beyond hoping for another miracle. What Giovanni did next would either save them all or doom them to become the largest addition to his phantom army yet. Instead of ordering his men to fight, Giovanni Simoncini told them to surrender. Not retreat. Not regroup. Not fight to the last man. Surrender. The order rippled through his section of trench like a physical shock. 83 men stared at their commanding officer with expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage to relief. Sir. Sergeant Parker had been in the army longer than Giovanni had been alive. Sir, did you say surrender? I said surrender, Giovanni confirmed, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who was no longer entirely sane. Drop your weapons. Raise your hands. Let them take the trench. The living soldiers thought their lieutenant had lost his mind. The dead soldiers knew better. Brilliant, Matthews whispered approvingly. Absolutely brilliant. Unorthodox, Bradley admitted, but effective. They'll court-martial you if any of you survive this, Wilson warned. You know that, right? Giovanni knew. He also knew that court-martial was preferable to adding 83 new voices to his phantom advisory board. But what Giovanni couldn't know was that his decision to surrender would trigger a chain of events that no one, living or dead, could have predicted. The enemy forces accepted the surrender. All 300 of them stopped their assault, secured the prisoners, and began setting up defensive positions in the captured trench. Standard procedure. Textbook warfare. Everything proceeding exactly as it should when one force surrenders to another. Except for one small detail that would change everything. The officer who accepted Giovanni's surrender was the same young lieutenant who had spoken to him in no man's land 4 months earlier. The one whose men Giovanni could hear whispering advice about prisoner management and defensive positioning. Because the enemy officer, it turned out, had his own phantom army. You, the officer said when he saw Giovanni among the prisoners. The one who hears voices. Giovanni nodded. There seemed no point in denying it anymore. I told my superiors about our conversation, the officer continued. They said I was suffering from combat fatigue. They recommended rest, medical evaluation, possible reassignment to non-combat duties. Did you take it? Giovanni asked. The officer laughed bitterly. I tried. But the voices followed me. They always follow you, don't they? No matter how far you run. And that's when two broken soldiers, on opposite sides of a war neither of them had chosen, discovered they had more in common than the countries that had sent them to kill each other. What happened next violated every rule of warfare, military discipline, and national loyalty that either man had ever been taught. Lieutenant Franz Weber, that was the enemy officer's name, made a decision that his superiors would later call treason and his phantom advisors would call survival. He released Giovanni's men, not officially. Not through proper channels. Not with documentation or approval from higher command. He simply opened the gates of the improvised prisoner pen and told 83 Allied soldiers to walk away. Why? Giovanni asked. Because my dead tell me the same thing your dead tell you, Weber replied quietly. This war is killing the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And we're helping it happen. The two officers spent the next hour sharing stories of phantom conversations, impossible decisions, and the weight of command that no training manual had prepared them to carry. They discovered that their ghosts gave similar advice: prioritize the living over the mission, question orders that seemed designed to maximize casualties, and remember that survival was more important than glory. But their alliance was about to be tested in the most horrible way possible. As Giovanni's men were retreating through the communication trenches, Private Rodriguez made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about this war. In one of the abandoned dugouts, Rodriguez found documents. Not military plans or tactical maps, but correspondence between high-ranking officers on both sides. Letters discussing casualty quotas, acceptable loss ratios, and something called the reduction protocol. What Rodriguez had stumbled across was evidence of the war's true purpose. The letters revealed that this section of the front line was being used as a testing ground. Both armies were experimenting with new weapons, new tactics, new methods of efficiently killing large numbers of soldiers. The men in the trenches weren't fighting for territory or strategic advantage. They were participants in a vast, cruel experiment designed to perfect the science of warfare. Giovanni and Weber's men weren't enemies. They were test subjects. Rodriguez brought the documents to Giovanni with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the papers steady. "Sir, you need to see this. You need to see what they're doing to us." Giovanni read the documents while 37 phantom voices whispered their own interpretations in his ears. The words were clinical, scientific, devoid of any acknowledgement that the test subjects and acceptable losses were human beings with families and dreams and heartbeats. But what broke Giovanni's heart wasn't the betrayal by his superiors. It was the realization that his phantom advisors had known all along. "We tried to tell you," Matthew said sadly. "We tried to warn you that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about learning how to kill more efficiently." The patterns were obvious, Bradley added. The way they rotated units through this sector. The way they supplied just enough ammunition to prolong the fighting without allowing decisive victories. The way they kept promoting men like you, men who were already broken enough to follow impossible orders. Giovanni Simoncini had spent 4 months believing he was fighting a war. Now he discovered he was starring in a laboratory experiment designed to perfect mass murder. Armed with the truth about their situation, Giovanni and Weber faced an impossible decision. They could expose the conspiracy, take the documents to war correspondents, to military investigators, to anyone who might listen and act on evidence of the systematic sacrifice of soldiers for experimental purposes. But exposing the truth would require them to return to their respective commands and pretend to be the loyal officers they had once been. It would require them to send more men to die while building a case that might never be heard by anyone with the power to stop it. Or they could disappear, take their men and vanish into the countryside. Become deserters and traitors and criminals, but living deserters and traitors and criminals who were no longer participating in someone else's experiment. The phantom advisors were divided. The older ghosts, Bradley, Torres's predecessor, a colonel who had died in Giovanni's second week, urged loyalty to duty despite the corruption they had uncovered. "You swore an oath," Bradley reminded him. "That oath doesn't become invalid just because the people above you are monsters." The newer ghosts, Chen, Matthews, the enemy soldiers who had died under dubious circumstances, argued for escape. "We died for nothing," Chen whispered. "Don't let them use you to kill more people for nothing." Giovanni stood at a crossroads between loyalty and sanity, between duty and survival, between the men he had been trained to be and the men his experiences had forced him to become. What Giovanni Simoncini decided in that moment would define not just his future, but the future of every man under his command. He chose a third option that neither the living nor the dead had suggested. Giovanni decided to turn his section of the trench into a sanctuary. Not for deserters, not for conscientious objectors, but for soldiers who had been damaged beyond the army's ability to recognize or treat. Working with Weber and using the intelligence they had gathered from the documents, Giovanni began identifying other shell-shocked soldiers throughout their sector. Men who heard voices, who flinched at shadows, who counted heartbeats that belonged to the dead. Men who had been broken by war but were still expected to function as soldiers. What they created was unprecedented in military history. A network of damaged soldiers who protected each other from both the enemy and their own commands. Men who shared resources, intelligence, and the burden of impossible decisions. Men who had learned that survival required abandoning everything they had been taught about warfare and embracing everything the dead had taught them about staying alive. But their sanctuary was built on a foundation of lies, and lies have a way of crumbling at the worst possible moments. 6 months after Giovanni's first shell shock attack, military investigators began asking questions about the unusual effectiveness of his command. Lieutenant Simoncini's section had the lowest casualty rate in the entire sector. His men were better fed, better equipped, and better informed than units with twice the official support. Enemy assaults against his position invariably failed, often without a shot being fired. Someone in high command wanted to know how Giovanni was accomplishing the impossible. The investigation began quietly. Casual questions during routine inspections, informal conversations with Giovanni's subordinates, reviews of his tactical reports and casualty documentation. What the investigators found was a pattern of behavior that defied military logic. Giovanni made decisions that shouldn't have worked but always did. He deployed men in positions that seemed random but invariably proved optimal. He stockpiled supplies that regulations said he shouldn't have access to. He maintained communication with enemy positions that should have been impossible to establish. But the investigators weren't prepared for what they discovered when they began interviewing Giovanni's men. When Sergeant Parker was asked about Lieutenant Simoncini's unusual methods, his response was carefully neutral. "Sir, the lieutenant has unconventional approaches to leadership. But his approaches work. We have the lowest casualty rate in the sector." When Private Williams was pressed for details about Giovanni's decision-making process, he was equally diplomatic. "The lieutenant seems to know things before they happen, sir. He moves us away from positions just before they get shelled. He orders supply runs that always find what we need. It's like he has extra information." But when they interviewed Private Kowalski, who had been in Giovanni's unit since the beginning, the carefully maintained fiction began to crack. "He talks to them, sir. The dead ones. He stands there having whole conversations with empty air, and then he gives us orders based on what they tell him. And the orders always work, sir. Always." The investigation took on new urgency. Military psychiatrist Captain Reynolds was brought in to evaluate Lieutenant Simoncini's mental state. The evaluation took place in a dugout that served as a makeshift office 20 yards behind the front line. Giovanni sat across a folding table from a man who had never heard artillery fire and tried to explain why he could hear the heartbeats of 41 dead soldiers. When did these auditory hallucinations begin? Reynolds asked, his pen poised over a medical form that would determine Giovanni's future. "They're not hallucinations," Giovanni replied calmly. "They're consultants." Reynolds looked up from his notes. Consultants. Dead soldiers who advise me on how to keep living soldiers alive. They have extensive experience with the various methods of dying in warfare. Their advice has been invaluable. What Reynolds wrote in his report would either save Giovanni's sanity or destroy his career. Reynolds spent an hour listening to Giovanni describe his Phantom Advisory Board. He took detailed notes about the conversations, the heartbeats, the way the dead provided tactical information that proved consistently accurate. But Reynolds had seen shell shock before. He knew the difference between battle fatigue and complete psychological breakdown. What he couldn't understand was why Giovanni's breakdown was so functional. "Lieutenant," Reynolds said finally, "you understand that these voices aren't real." Giovanni considered this. "Are you real?" "Of course I'm real." "How do you know?" Reynolds frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, how do you know you're real?" "Because you can touch things. Because other people can see you. Because you have thoughts and feelings and a heartbeat." Giovanni leaned forward, and Reynolds saw something in his eyes that made him deeply uncomfortable. "My dead soldiers can touch things too, Doctor. They move equipment when nobody's looking. They leave warnings written in the mud. They have thoughts and feelings and heartbeats. Other people just can't see them because other people haven't been where I've been." What Reynolds realized in that moment was that Giovanni Simoncini wasn't suffering from hallucinations. He was suffering from a new form of reality that the medical establishment had no framework for understanding. Dr. Reynolds's psychiatric evaluation of Lieutenant Giovanni Simoncini was unlike any document in military medical history. Translation: Giovanni Simoncini was crazy, but his craziness was keeping soldiers alive. And the army wanted to understand how to replicate it. What happened next transformed Giovanni from a patient into a test subject. Instead of being discharged, Giovanni was transferred to a special unit designated Experimental Tactical Division. Officially, it was a think tank designed to develop innovative battlefield strategies. Unofficially, it was a laboratory for studying soldiers who had been broken in useful ways. Giovanni found himself commanding a company of men who had all been damaged by war in different ways. There was Captain Mills, who could predict artillery strikes by the taste of metal in his mouth. Sergeant Thompson, who could identify enemy positions by the smell of their cooking fires. Lieutenant Burke, who claimed he could see the ghosts of enemy soldiers and used their positions to plan assaults. They were all insane. They were all brilliant. And they were all more effective than any normal military unit had ever been. The Experimental Tactical Division achieved the impossible. They won. Not just battles, but consistently, predictably, systematically. They developed tactics that seemed random but invariably worked. They avoided casualties through methods that couldn't be explained in official reports. They gathered intelligence through sources that didn't exist on any organizational chart. Giovanni's Phantom Advisors were the perfect military intelligence network. They never slept, never lied, never had agendas beyond keeping the living alive. Within 6 months, the Experimental Tactical Division had become the most successful unit in the entire theater of operations. They were studied, documented, and quietly replicated. Other commanders began requesting shell-shocked soldiers for their units. The Army discovered that madness, properly channeled, was the most effective weapon they had ever developed. But success in war always comes with a price, and Giovanni was about to learn what that price was. 1 year after his first shell-shock attack, Giovanni Simoncini commanded a battalion of the living and a regiment of the dead. His Phantom Advisors now numbered in the hundreds. Every soldier who had died under his command, every enemy who had fallen to his tactics, every casualty from every unit that had been influenced by his methods. They filled his vision during the day and crowded his dreams at night. Their voices overlapped and contradicted and harmonized in a symphony of post-mortem advice that never stopped playing. Giovanni had become the most successful military commander in the war. He had also become something that was no longer entirely human. The living soldiers under his command revered him. They called him the prophet and the ghost whisperer and the man who could see tomorrow. They followed his orders without question because his orders kept them alive when logic said they should die. But the dead soldiers in his head had a different perspective. "You're using us," Matthews accused during one of their nightly conferences. "We're not advisors anymore. We're tools." "You've become what they wanted you to become," Bradley added. "A machine for processing death into victory." "You've forgotten something important," Chen whispered. "You've forgotten that we were people before we were casualties." And Giovanni realized, with the clarity that comes from complete madness, that his ghosts were right. In the 13th month of his phantom consultancy, Giovanni Simoncini did something that shocked both the living and the dead. He resigned his commission, not quietly, not through proper channels, not with medical justification or appeals for understanding. He simply walked into his commanding officer's tent and announced that he was no longer willing to be a soldier. "I've become too good at keeping people alive to continue participating in their systematic murder," he explained to a colonel who had no framework for understanding such a statement. The resignation letter Giovanni submitted was unlike any document in military history. He listed his phantom advisors by name, rank, and cause of death. He described the tactical advantages of consulting with the dead. He provided detailed recommendations for identifying and utilizing shell-shocked soldiers as military assets. He concluded with a request that his methods be discontinued immediately. Because Giovanni Simoncini had realized that his success was built on the suffering of men who deserved better than being transformed into instruments of more suffering. The Army's response to Giovanni's resignation was swift and devastating. He was arrested for dereliction of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and providing aid and comfort to the enemy. The court-martial was a foregone conclusion. Military justice had no provision for soldiers who claimed to receive tactical advice from the dead. But the prosecution made a critical error. They called Dr. Reynolds as a witness to testify about Giovanni's mental state. Reynolds, who had spent the past year studying the experimental tactical division, had reached conclusions that the Army didn't want to hear. Lieutenant Simoncini, Reynolds testified, is suffering from a severe psychological condition that makes him exceptionally effective at warfare. His hallucinations provide him with tactical advantages that normal soldiers don't possess. In my professional opinion, he is simultaneously unfit for duty and the most competent military commander I have ever evaluated. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Reynolds's testimony sank in. The court-martial lasted 3 days and resulted in a verdict that satisfied no one. Giovanni Simoncini was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to medical discharge with full honors. He would be stripped of his rank, banned from military service, and committed to psychiatric treatment, but he would also receive a medal for distinguished service and a pension for combat-related disabilities. The Army wanted to punish him for abandoning his duty and reward him for performing it too well. The contradiction was perfect military logic. Giovanni accepted the verdict with the calm of a man who had stopped caring about the opinions of the living. His phantom advisors had their own perspectives on military justice, and their commentary was far more interesting than anything the court had to say. But Giovanni's story doesn't end with his discharge. It ends with what he discovered about the nature of peace. Giovanni Simoncini returned to civilian life with 41 dead soldiers in his head and no idea how to be a person who wasn't responsible for keeping other people alive. The transition was harder than the war had been. In the trenches, Giovanni had known his purpose. His job was to make decisions that kept his men breathing for another day. The decisions were impossible and the stakes were life and death, but at least the objectives were clear. In civilian life, Giovanni discovered that his phantom advisors had no idea how to help him. The dead were experts at survival in combat. They could predict enemy movements, identify safe positions, and navigate the complex mathematics of battlefield mortality. But they knew nothing about paying rent, finding employment, or having conversations with people who had never heard artillery fire. Giovanni found himself more isolated from the living than he had ever been in the war. Giovanni tried to return to his pre-war life, but discovered that his pre-war self was another casualty of the conflict. He had been a clerk before the war. A quiet man who filed documents and kept accurate records and went home to a small apartment where he read books and listened to radio programs and lived the unremarkable life of someone who had never been responsible for anyone's death. That man was gone. Giovanni had killed him as surely as he had killed Matthews and Chen and the 41 others who followed him around like a military procession of the damned. His family welcomed him home with tears and celebration and relief that he had survived when so many others hadn't. They wanted to hear stories about his service, about the medals he had earned, about the men he had led. They wanted him to be proud of what he had accomplished. Giovanni tried to give them what they wanted. But every story he told was accompanied by commentary from the men who had lived it and died in it. Tell them about the time you saved Williams from the gas attack, Matthews suggested. Don't tell them how you knew where the gas was coming from, Bradley warned. Tell them Williams died 3 days later anyway, Wilson added with his characteristic pessimism. Giovanni's attempts at normal conversation became increasingly surreal as he found himself responding to voices that his family couldn't hear. 6 months after his discharge, Giovanni found work as a night watchman at a factory that manufactured bandages for military hospitals. It was perfect employment for a man who no longer slept. Giovanni would spend his shifts walking empty corridors, checking locks that were never tested, protecting equipment that nobody wanted to steal. The job required minimal interaction with other people and maximum time alone with his thoughts. Which was exactly what Giovanni didn't need. In the silence of the empty factory, his phantom advisors became more active than they had ever been during the war. Without the distraction of incoming artillery and life-or-death decisions, Giovanni could focus completely on their conversations. And their conversations were becoming increasingly disturbing. The dead soldiers were bored. They had signed up to provide tactical advice for combat situations, not to watch their former commander spend 8 hours a night making sure nobody stole industrial sewing machines. This is not what we died for, Matthews complained during Giovanni's first week on the job. We didn't die so you could become a security guard, Bradley added. We died so you could learn to keep people alive, Chen whispered. But you're not keeping anyone alive anymore. You're just existing. Giovanni tried to explain that civilian life was different, that keeping people alive in peacetime meant different things. But his phantom advisors weren't convinced. The dead soldiers began pressuring Giovanni to find a way to use his abilities in civilian life. There are people who need saving, Matthews argued. Not from artillery, but from poverty, from disease, from the kind of despair that kills people slowly instead of quickly. You have skills, Bradley insisted. You can see patterns, predict outcomes, make decisions under pressure. Those skills don't become useless just because nobody's shooting at you. Giovanni resisted their suggestions at first. He had done enough saving. He had made enough decisions. He wanted nothing more than to fade into anonymity and let someone else be responsible for the welfare of others. But the dead can be very persuasive. They began showing him things. Not visions or prophecies, but patterns in the world around him that his trained eye could recognize. The way certain factory workers moved that indicated injury or illness. The signs of malnutrition in children he passed on the street. The predictable patterns of poverty and suffering that played out like military campaigns in the civilian world. Giovanni realized that war hadn't ended, it had just changed uniforms. 8 months after his discharge, Giovanni volunteered at a hospital that treated returning soldiers. It was Chin who suggested it. "You know what we're going through," the boy's ghost reasoned. "You could help them understand that they're not going crazy. Or if they are, that being crazy doesn't mean being useless." The hospital was full of men like Giovanni, soldiers who had been broken in ways that medicine couldn't fix and psychology couldn't explain. Men who flinched at sudden noises, who couldn't sleep, who stared at walls and whispered to people who weren't there. Giovanni recognized the symptoms because he lived them every day. His first patient was a young corporal named Davis who claimed he could smell enemy soldiers from a mile away. The doctors had labeled him as suffering from olfactory hallucinations and were treating him with bed rest and sedatives. Giovanni knew better. "What do they smell like?" Giovanni asked during their first conversation. Davis looked at him suspiciously. "You believe me?" "I hear the voices of 41 dead soldiers," Giovanni replied. "I'm not in a position to doubt anyone's unusual sensory experiences." What Davis described was not hallucination but hypervigilance, a survival mechanism that his brain had developed to detect threats that normal senses couldn't perceive. Within a year of starting his volunteer work, Giovanni had created an informal network of soldiers who were healing from mental wounds that the medical establishment couldn't treat. They met in the hospital basement, in abandoned buildings, in parks after dark. Men who heard voices, who saw ghosts, who had developed impossible abilities as side effects of being broken by war. They shared strategies for managing their symptoms, techniques for functioning in a world that didn't understand them, and most importantly, validation that they weren't alone in their damage. Giovanni's phantom advisors approved of this work. "This is what we died for," Matthew said approvingly. "Not for territory or glory, but for understanding. For helping people survive what shouldn't be survivable." "You're building something new," Bradley observed. "Not a military unit, but something better. Something that heals instead of destroys." But Giovanni's growing reputation as someone who could help shell-shocked soldiers was attracting attention from people who wanted to exploit rather than heal. 18 months after leaving the army, Giovanni Simoncini received a visit from military intelligence. They came to his apartment on a Tuesday evening, 2 officers in unmarked uniforms with briefcases full of documents he wasn't supposed to see. They had an offer that wasn't really an offer and a request that wasn't really a request. They wanted him back. Not as a soldier, Giovanni's medical discharge was permanent and irreversible, but as a consultant. The Army had spent the past year studying his methods and attempting to replicate his success. They had failed spectacularly. Other officers could learn to listen for phantom voices, but they couldn't learn to hear the right voices. They could develop hallucinations, but not useful hallucinations. They could break their minds, but they couldn't break them in the precise way that Giovanni had broken his. "We need your expertise," the senior officer explained. We're developing new training programs for officers in high-stress environments. Your insights could save thousands of lives." Giovanni listened to the offer while 41 phantom voices provided commentary. "They want to weaponize us," Matthews said grimly. "They want to create more soldiers like you," Bradley added. "More men who hear the dead. They want to industrialize madness," Wilson concluded. "Turn trauma into a training program." Giovanni looked at the officers and felt something he hadn't experienced since the war: anger. "No," Giovanni said simply. The officers seemed unprepared for this response. They had brought documentation of his service record, testimonials from soldiers he had saved, statistical analyses of his tactical success. They had prepared arguments about duty, patriotism, and the greater good. They hadn't prepared for a man who took advice from the dead. "Mr. Simoncini," the senior officer tried again, "you have an opportunity to serve your country in a way that could revolutionize military medicine. The techniques you developed could create more people like me," Giovanni interrupted. "More soldiers who carry the dead around in their heads like luggage. More men who can't sleep because the ghosts want to have strategy meetings at 3 in the morning." The officers exchanged glances. They had expected negotiation, not philosophy. "The techniques you developed saved lives," the junior officer pointed out. "The techniques I developed," Giovanni replied, "were side effects of my mind being shattered by experiences no human being should have to endure." You want to shatter more minds on purpose, in controlled conditions, to see if you can replicate the useful parts of madness while avoiding the inconvenient parts. He stood up, and the officers could see in his eyes the same calm certainty that had made him so effective in combat. The answer is no. Find another way to keep your soldiers alive. A way that doesn't require breaking them first. After the military intelligence officers left, Giovanni sat alone in his apartment and had his first honest conversation with his phantom advisors in months. "You did the right thing," Chen said approvingly. "They would have hurt more people trying to replicate what happened to you. But they'll find another way," Matthews warned. "They always do. Someone else will develop methods for creating useful madness. Someone less ethical than you." Giovanni knew Matthews was right. The army had discovered that broken soldiers could be more effective than whole ones, and that knowledge wouldn't simply disappear because one man refused to cooperate. "So what do we do?" Giovanni asked his phantom counsel. The answer came from an unexpected source, the enemy officer Weber, whose ghost had joined Giovanni's advisors after Weber was executed for treason by his own command. "We prepare the living for what's coming," Weber suggested. "We teach them to recognize the early signs of useful madness. We help them understand the difference between breakdown and breakthrough. We create alternatives to military solutions for civilian problems." Giovanni spent the next 2 years building something unprecedented, a support network for people whose minds had been changed by trauma into something more than human and less than whole. 5 years after the shell that should have killed him, Giovanni Simoncini had created something that had never existed before, a functioning community of the functionally broken. His network included hundreds of former soldiers, but also civilians who had been damaged by other kinds of trauma. Industrial accidents that left men hearing the voices of dead co-workers. House fires that gave women the ability to smell smoke that wasn't there. Car crashes that taught people to predict accidents before they happened. They were all broken. They were all functional. They were all more effective at their chosen work than they had been before their damage. Giovanni's apartment became an informal headquarters for people who needed to understand that their unusual symptoms weren't necessarily signs of illness. Sometimes, they were signs of evolution. But Giovanni's phantom advisors had one more lesson to teach him. 10 years after his first shell shock attack, Giovanni Simoncini finally understood what his phantom advisors had been trying to tell him all along. The voices weren't hallucinations. They weren't manifestations of trauma or guilt or psychological damage. They were something else entirely. They were the part of himself that had learned to survive impossible circumstances by expanding beyond the normal limits of human consciousness. Every person who died under Giovanni's command had taught him something. Not through supernatural communication, but through the simple process of incorporating their knowledge, their experiences, their perspectives into his own decision-making framework. Matthews had taught him to question authority. Bradley had taught him tactical thinking. Chen had taught him the value of innocence. Wilson had taught him the reality of death. Weber had taught him that enemies were often just people in different uniforms. Giovanni's phantom advisors were actually the integrated wisdom of everyone who had trusted him with their lives, and whose deaths had forced him to become something larger than himself. What Giovanni Simoncini discovered after 10 years of living with the dead was that survival sometimes requires becoming more than human. He still heard the voices. He still counted phantom heartbeats. He still had conversations with advisors who existed only in the expanded landscape of his post-traumatic consciousness. But he had learned to see these symptoms not as signs of madness, but as evidence of adaptation. His mind had stretched beyond normal human limits to accommodate experiences that normal human consciousness couldn't process. The voices weren't hallucinations. They were his brain's way of integrating wisdom that could only be gained through loss. Giovanni had become something new, a person whose consciousness included not just his own experiences, but the accumulated experiences of everyone whose death had taught him something about life. And in a world that was increasingly good at breaking people, Giovanni's example showed that broken people could be more than whole, if they learned to carry their damage as strength rather than weakness. The shell that was supposed to kill Giovanni Simoncini had instead created someone who couldn't be killed by conventional means. Someone who carried an army of the dead as protection against a world that specialized in creating more dead. Today, 30 years after the war ended, Giovanni Simoncini still counts heartbeats. Not 41 anymore, but hundreds. Every person he has helped, every soldier he has guided through the transition from broken to functional, every individual whose survival has been improved by lessons learned from the dead. They are his true legacy, not the battles he won or the men he saved during the war, but the people he has taught to carry their trauma as wisdom rather than burden. Giovanni lives quietly now, in a small house with a garden where he grows vegetables and flowers with equal care. Visitors often comment on how peaceful he seems, how centered, how undisturbed by the chaos of modern life. What they don't know is that Giovanni Simoncini is never alone. His phantom advisors are still there, still offering commentary, still providing the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has ever trusted him with something precious and fragile, their lives, their hope, their faith that someone, somewhere, understands what it means to survive the unsurvivable. And every morning, when Giovanni wakes up and begins another day of being more than human and less than whole, he counts the heartbeats of the dead and thanks them for teaching him the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the only way to stay alive is to let part of yourself die. And sometimes the only way to stay sane is to carefully, deliberately, consciously go insane. But always, always, you keep counting. Because as long as you can count heartbeats, your own heart is still beating. And as long as your heart is still beating, you still have work to do. Giovanni Simoncini learned that survival isn't about staying the same person through terrible experiences. Survival is about becoming whatever kind of person can carry the weight of what you've seen and still find reasons to keep breathing. 7 minutes can change everything. But what comes after those 7 minutes, that's where you discover who you really are.